right, let's open the scriptures to Exodus 4. I've got to write a thought down, or I'm going to forget this. But you find Exodus 4. Fresh off the press. All right, Exodus chapter 4. And this morning we had seen, boy, how Moses, he was one for making excuses. And God said, Moses, look, this is the job I have for you. Go do it. And Moses began to make the excuse, who am I? And God's response to Moses' first excuse was, certainly I will go with thee. Moses, I'm going to be with you. Don't worry about it. Then Moses' second excuse was, Lord, we don't even know your name. Essentially, Lord, who are you? And God gave Moses his name in that unique statement, I am that I am. Then we saw Moses at the beginning of chapter 4 gave another excuse. And he said, but the people. So he's looking at himself. I can't do this, God, because of me. I can't do this because of you. I can't do this because of the people. And then the fourth excuse was he looks at himself again, God, I'm just not a good speaker. And so God answers all those excuses. But what I want to look at tonight, not only how, at the beginning Moses delayed, but tonight we're going to look, at the beginning of this chapter, Moses made excuses. Tonight I want us to look and see how Moses delayed. God clearly communicated to Moses exactly what he wants him to do. Communication is pretty important. Sometimes people don't do what you want them to do because you've not communicated it to them clearly. Well, I don't think anybody can argue that God made it very, very clear to Moses exactly what he wanted him to do. Moses' first response, again, Moses responded to God's call by giving him 4 excuses why he couldn't do what God had called him to do. And of course, God didn't accept any of those excuses. Not one of his excuses was valid. And we kind of made the point this morning that there are many people today that try to make excuses why they can't do what God's called them to do. And none of those excuses are valid. But what we're going to see in Exodus chapter 4, let's look in verse number 14. And this is kind of where we left off this morning. Moses gives all those excuses. And we left off, and notice what verse number 14 says of Exodus chapter 4. It says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. That's more than God was just angry with Moses, right? What's that word that kind of modifies it, that tells us that God was a little bit more than just angry? See what it said? What was that? Kindled, like a fire. He was, if you will, hot. And And God's a patient and long-suffering God. He is not quick to anger. And Moses, I don't know, if you will, knew how to press God's buttons. That may be the right way to put it, I don't know. But evidently, he sure made God mad. He made him very angry. His anger was kindled against Moses. And so here God is angry at him. And God's just telling Moses, go. This is what I want you to do. And you would think that God's anger towards Moses would have put a fire under Moses to do what God told him to do. I mean, parents, sometimes when you want your kids to do something, do it right now. You raise your voice, you get firm with them, you let them know you mean business. And hopefully, they go do what you told them to do, right? That's kind of the picture. God is angry at Moses. You would think Moses would be like a bullet out of a gun. I'm going to do what God said do, or he's going to whoop me back. But he didn't. He didn't. You would have thought God's anger kindled against Moses would have put a fire under Moses to do what God called him to do. But it didn't. Not at all. And again, Moses moves on from making excuses in the first part of this chapter to procrastinating. He's delaying and dragging his feet as long as he can. Anybody know what people like that? Yeah. Yes. And they come in all variety of ages, right? Moses is 80 years old and the man is still procrastinating. So let's just look at how Moses is delaying and procrastinating to do God's will. Verse number 14 again. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? This is God talking to Moses. Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? Because verse 13, Moses is kind of saying, Lord, send somebody else, right? And God says, in verse 14, he says, I know that he can speak well. God's telling Moses, I know your brother's a good speaker, but I didn't call Aaron to do this. I called you to do this. That's essentially what God is saying. I know that he can speak well. But notice, this is a miracle right here. And we're going to tie this in at the end of the message. But notice what God is telling to Moses. Remember, he's on the mountain of God. God's appeared to him in a burning bush. And God says, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. He says, Aaron's coming to meet you, Moses. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. Now, I'm going to prepare you for the end of the message. And I was sharing this a little bit before the service tonight with Miss Dorothy and Brother John, Miss Kara. Moses came from Egypt, remember, Goshen. Well, he came from Egypt, and he was fleeing for his life, right? And now he's in Midian, but specifically he's in Horeb here at the Mount of God. And just roughly looking at my maps in the Bible, it's getting really close to 200 miles away. Moses is about 150, 200 miles away from Egypt. And how long has Moses been in Midian? Somebody tell us. What was that? 40 years. And all of a sudden, God's speaking to Moses. And he tells Moses, Aaron's on his way to come see you. All right? Does that sound a little strange? How did Aaron know where Moses was at? We'll get to that in a minute. Verse number 15. He's been gone for 40 years. He's been hiding, right? He's been in hiding for 40 years. All right. But God's telling Moses that Aaron's coming to see you in verse 15. Thou shalt speak unto him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall do. God's just telling Moses, I'm going to teach you. I'm going to be there with you. Verse 16, and he shall be thy spokesman unto the people. So God is telling Moses, he said, okay, I'll let Aaron be your spokesman to the people. And he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. You see what God's doing here? He says, God's saying, Moses, I'm going to talk to you directly, and you're going to take that and tell Aaron. I'm not going to bypass you to talk to Aaron, is what he's saying. And he says that Aaron is going to talk to the people. But we'll see later that it is still Moses that speaks to Pharaoh. Okay, verse 17, and thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. And Moses went and returned to Jethro his father-in-law, and said unto him, let me go, I pray thee, and return unto my brethren, which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now we're getting to the next verse. We're going to see the first delay in Moses' obedience to God's call. He'd given several excuses in the first part of the chapter. But now we're going to see how the man drags his feet. I think by the time we get to the end of it, I think I know a lot of people that learned about procrastinating from Moses. I mean, you just don't ever get anything done. All right, here's the first thing that delayed Moses in verse number 19. And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian. Now hold on a minute. Verse number 18, Moses is where? Well, he's in Midian, but he's asking Jethro, and he says, let me go to Egypt. Right? Verse 19, the Lord said unto Moses in Midian. Notice the next word, go. Return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. All right, let's just lay some groundwork. God told Moses to go back in verse 12 when he was on the mountain. Now therefore go. He's angry with them. Get out of here, Moses. Go to Egypt. Go. Verse number 18, Moses gets his father-in-law's blessing. And in the last part of verse number 18, Jethro says, Moses, go. You better go. Go. God says go. Jethro says go. And Moses asked Jethro, says, let me go to Egypt. But verse 19, why is Moses still in Midian in verse 19? I mean, God's saying go. Everyone's saying go, 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 go. He even asks permission, asks the blessing, but he never leaves. You see that? The Lord said to Moses in Midian. He's still there. He's still dragging his feet. He doesn't ever leave. And we can see why Moses never leaves in verse 19 in God's response. See if you can, I know you can figure out. Why didn't Moses leave in verse 19? What was that? He's scared. He was afraid. Fear was controlling Moses. He's still in Midian because of fear. Moses allowed his fear of man to prevent him from obeying God's call. Think, well, I thought I was the only one that had a problem with that. Moses had the same problem. He was afraid of Pharaoh, and he was probably afraid of other people. And he allowed that fear of what other people thought or what other people would do to him to prevent him from doing what God called him to do. Anybody ever been in a situation like that? Absolutely. You know God wants you to do something, but you're afraid of what they'll say, they'll think, they'll do, how they'll act, whatever. You're afraid of it. You're allowing that fear to prevent you from doing what God's called you to do. Moses had to get past that. It was crippling him. He wasn't doing what God wanted him to do, what God called him to do. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't doing anything. Just sitting there, dragging his feet. But God, look what he does in verse number 19. God calms Moses' fears by assuring him with his word. He says, "Go, return into Egypt, for all the men," that's plural, right? "All the men are dead which sought thy life." He's saying, Moses, look, you got to get past this. Don't be afraid of them. Those men are dead. And earlier in the chapter, God says, "Moses, certainly I will be with thee." Folks, what a great lesson. If God's with you, you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to worry about anything. So Moses is being delayed. His fear is delaying Moses. All right, look in verse number 20. Here's the next one. Right, the very next verse, here's another thing. And we're going to see that, I hope you can find this. In verse number 20 it says, "And Moses took his wife and his sons," plural, "and set them upon an ass." So his sons, plural, we know it's more than just Gershom here. "And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned," notice this phrase, it's important, "he returned to the land of Egypt." Remember that. He went to the land of Egypt. "And Moses took the rod of God in his hand." All right, he's doing what God told him to do, right? But notice what verse 21 says. "And the Lord said unto Moses," look at this next word, "when thou goest to return into Egypt." Everybody see what's going on? What was that? He's on the border. I'm going to make this point that Moses is partial obedience is delaying Moses. Partial obedience is delaying Moses. God said go to Egypt, so he's in the land of Egypt. But he's not where he's supposed to be in Egypt. Moses knew where he was supposed to go. He's supposed to go where? To Pharaoh. He knew where he was supposed to go. But here he is, just in the land of Egypt, and he's thinking, "Oh, I guess this is good enough. Anybody ever know? Doesn't that get under your skin? When you tell somebody to do something, they have to do it. Ladies, don't look at your husbands. They have to do it. God told Moses, "I want you to do this." Moses half did it. But listen, partial obedience really is disobedience. So Moses is playing the technicality game, right? Well, I'm in Egypt, God. That's where he told me to go. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. The Lord said to Moses, verse 21, "When thou goest to return into Egypt," you're not where you're supposed to be, Moses. "See that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I've put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go." He's partially obeying the Lord. Let's read on. "And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, this is God's telling Moses, and he's saying, you tell this to Pharaoh. And I say unto thee, let my son go that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. God tells Moses, he says, you tell Pharaoh, and you don't hem haw around, you don't beat around the bush, you lay it on the line. You're going to do this or God's going to kill your son. That's it. Well, I think you ought to sit down and negotiate and come to terms with each other. No. This is the way it's going to be, or your son's going to die. God here is not in the negotiating business. So Moses, again, in verse number 24, he delays again. Okay? Verse 24. And it came to pass. That's an interesting phrase. What's that mean? And it came to pass. What's that? It happened. God's telling Moses, go, 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 go. But verse 24 says, and it came to pass, and here's another little phrase, by the way. All right, we know that according to the previous verses, Moses is in the land of Egypt, right? But now it says, and it came to pass by the way, and notice the next little phrase, in the end. That the Lord met him, all right, this is good, and sought to kill him. Whoa, that's not good. What's going on in verse 24? What's that? We're looking at Moses is delaying. He's procrastinating. See that? He's in Egypt, but it came to pass. There's a certain amount of time. Here's a question. How much time must have passed before the Lord met him? And how long had Moses procrastinated? Or let me put it this way. Moses had procrastinated so much that a patient God was now ready to kill him. Moses, he's allowing, I put it this way, relaxation to delay him. Where's he at in verse 24? He's at the end. Well, what do you do at the end? You don't work, do you? He's on vacation. Yeah. He's at the vacation. He's taking a vacation. He's chilling out here. And it came to pass. Well, how long he had been there? How long had you been there, Moses? It came to pass. You're in Egypt, but now you're at the end. And some amount of time's passed by. It came to pass. By the way, well, where in the world's he even at? Where's by the way? It's not where he's supposed to be, that's for sure. But he's in an inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. He's dragging his feet some more. If the Bible hadn't told me, I might assume that Moses was probably 17, 18, 19 years old here, right? We might extend that into the 20s a little. I mean, he's just dragging. He doesn't want to clean his room. He doesn't want this. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want to go to work. He doesn't want to do it. It came to pass, by the way, in the end that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Procrastinating. Verse 25, here's another delay in Moses' obedience. And I'm going to put it this way, that here in verse number 25, that Moses' disobedience delayed him from obeying God's call. Because look what verse number 25 says. It says, then. Now here's a very, very interesting verse. Because verse 24, he's ready to kill Moses. Dragging your feet. But verse 25 says, then Zipporah, that's his wife, took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. And then verse 26 says, so he let him go. Then she said, a bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. So we know Moses here has two sons. And our best understanding of these verses, at least at this time, Moses is delaying. He's procrastinating. In verse 24, God's angry with him. He's ready to kill him. But in verse number 25, we know that God is going to use Moses to deliver God's commandments to his people. And here Moses is with two sons, and one of them isn't even circumcised. So Moses, the one that's supposed to deliver God's law to his people, isn't even obeying God's law himself. And so his wife steps in, takes the initiative, throws it on his feet, and you're a bloody husband to me because of the circumcision. She's doing something that he should have already done. He should have taken care of it. But now God's ready to kill him because of his disobedience and his procrastination. And she essentially saves his life. Because verse 26 says, so he let him go. Who's the he in verse 26? And who's the him? Moses. God let Moses. That's interesting. So he let him go. God let him go. Kind of got that, God's got him right here. And you ain't going nowhere till you get things right. And if you don't get things right, I'm going to kill you. Well, God wouldn't act that way. Yeah, he would. He can pinch your head off if he wants to. Moses delayed by disobedience. I wonder how many of God's people, God's called them to do something, but they don't. Things are not right in their life. They're disobedient to God, and because of their disobedience, it's just this long, drawn-out delay in doing God's will. And they'll never do what God's called them to do until they first get things right. Until they do what they're supposed to do. They're disobedient. They're not following God's law, following God's commandments. They're not obeying Him. Therefore, it's this long delay in accomplishing God's call on their life. Because they're just not doing what God wants them to do. It's a big delay. Lastly here, let's pick up in verse number 27. And here we're going to tie in what we mentioned at the beginning of the message here. And what we're seeing here, I think what we read in most of these verses, it's kind of a parenthetical, right? And verse number 27 let me just read it. It says, and the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. Remember we said, how did Aaron know to go meet Moses in verse number 14? Well, verse number 27 says that the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went, and look where Aaron met Moses. And met him in the mount of God and kissed him. Well, where was it that Moses was at when God was speaking to him through the burning bush? We didn't forget, did we? Rachel said it. He's in the very same place. Moses was in the mount of God. God was speaking to him, telling him what he should do. He gave all the excuses. He tried to delay. He gave all the excuses. The delay happened afterward. But God is motivating Moses by all of a sudden, 40 years after he left Egypt, 40 years, didn't tell anybody where he was going because he didn't know where he was going himself. God puts it in Moses' heart to go to the Mount of God with his flock of sheep. But here's the amazing thing. 200 miles away, God had already spoken to Aaron before he spoke to Moses. How long do you think it took Aaron to travel 200 miles to where Moses was going to be? God had to tell Aaron a couple weeks before. And here Aaron is on his way before Moses even knows it. And here on that mountain, God's speaking to Moses, and in an act of encouragement and motivation, God has his brother show up at the same time. That just blows my mind. That's amazing. God was working in people's heart before Moses even knew about it. You know, God doesn't have to tell us all the details. Aaron came to the Mount of God at the same time Moses was there. And what do I mean? I guess probably after God was done talking to Moses, probably. Is that what it looks like to you? That's what it looks like to me. The Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. In verse 27, he went and met him in the Mount of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord who had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spake all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. Remember, Moses didn't think they'd believe him. But God said they would, and they did. And the people believed him when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel. That's an interesting phrase. When the elders heard that the Lord had visited, past tense, when the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked upon their affliction, look what it says. Then they bowed their heads and worshiped. Well, it says in verse number 16 of chapter 3, God tells Moses, go and gather the elders of Israel together, saying to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me, saying, look at this phrase, I have surely visited you and seen that which is done to you in Egypt. Here's the point I'm trying to make here. God had visited them in Goshen, in Egypt, and the people didn't even know God showed up. Here, when Moses tells them that God was there, God visited you, their response was they bowed their heads and worshiped. God was here and we didn't even know it. And now they're acknowledging it, bowing their heads, and worshiping God. That's reverence. Reverence. But here is just a few things that Moses did to delay, to procrastinate from obeying God's call. How about you tonight? Has God put something on your heart? You know you should be doing something. But maybe from this morning's message, just like Moses, you've been trying to give God every excuse why you can't. Maybe you're to the same point Moses was here. Maybe you're done giving excuses. You know you're going to do it, but you're just half doing it. Maybe fear is preventing you from doing it. Maybe you're just procrastinating. Well, maybe God, if that's you, I ask that you'd look around in your life. Maybe God has sent you someone to motivate you, just like God sent Aaron to encourage and motivate him. might have. Don't keep making excuses. Don't procrastinate any longer. Let's stand and be dismissed. Heavenly